September 11th, 1683. Vienna was in its death throes. Inside the battered, pockmarked walls, soldiers resorted to eating horse carcasses and even weeds to survive. But the true horror lay not in hunger, but beneath their very feet. Thousands of Ottoman sappers were silently packing tons of explosives into the city's foundations. With just a single spark, the walls would crumble. The gateway to Western Europe would fall. Rome would be the next target, and the history of Christianity would likely cease. Surrounding them was a tide of steel 300,000 strong, a force so overwhelming it defied logic. No one believed they would live to see the dawn. Yet history always makes room for the impossible. Just as absolute despair took hold, the ground atop Kahlenberg Hill began to tremble violently. It was not an earthquake, but the thunder of tens of thousands of hooves. Was this Vienna's end, or a miracle from God? A storm of steel was descending from the heights, and in the next few hours, the fate of all Europe would be sealed forever. What seismic shock would the trembling ground at Kahlenberg unleash? To answer that, we must first begin with the nightmare that kept all of Europe awake. The architect of this terror was Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. To Kara Mustafa, Vienna was the golden apple, the ultimate prize, and the beating heart of the Holy Roman Empire. It stood as the final barrier to the West. His ambition was not simply to conquer, it was to consume. If Vienna fell, the road to Germany would lie open, and the path to Rome would be unguarded. He did not just bring an army to the gates of Vienna, he brought a migration of death. 300,000 men. In the 17th century, this was not a military formation. It was a moving nation, a biological tide of conquest. The column was so vast that when his vanguard was already setting up siege lines in Austria, his rearguard was still marching across the borders of Hungary, hundreds of miles away. At the tip of this spear were the Janissaries. These were not conscripted peasants holding pitchforks, but the elite of the elite. Stolen from their families as children, brainwashed and forged in the fires of constant war, they were human machines. Disciplined, fanatical, and terrifyingly silent in their advance, they were the harbingers of the end times. Standing against this tsunami of steel was a ghost crew. Inside the crumbling walls of Vienna, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg looked out at the horizon and saw his doom. He commanded only 15,000 exhausted garrison troops and a city infrastructure that was falling apart. Starhemberg was a commander of iron will fighting a battle he was never meant to win because Vienna had been abandoned. In an act that stained the crown, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I had fled the city with his entire court just days before the Ottomans arrived. He took the wealth, the nobility, and the hope, leaving Starhemberg and the common citizens behind as a sacrificial lamb. Starhemberg knew they were alone. He knew they were designated to die. But instead of despair, he chose defiance. He issued an order that chilled the blood of every soldier and civilian alike. Anyone who spoke the word surrender would be shot on sight. He understood the nature of his enemy. To surrender to Kara Mustafa was not a guarantee of life. It was a guarantee of slavery. There was no way out, so the only way was through the fire. By August, the war on the surface had reached a bloody stalemate. The massive Ottoman cannons pounded the walls day and night, turning the city's perimeter into a moonscape of rubble. Yet the walls held. Vienna refused to break. Kara Mustafa grew impatient. He looked at the defiant stone and decided that if he could not go through it, he would go under it. He ordered a shift to the most brutal claustrophobic form of warfare known to mansapping. The war moved underground. Thousands of Ottoman miners, the best engineers in the world, began carving a labyrinth of tunnels like termites eating through wood. Their goal was to reach the foundations of the defensive towers, pack them with black powder, and blow the city into oblivion. To counter this, the Viennese defenders had to become rats. They grabbed pickaxes and shovels, digging counter tunnels to intercept the enemy in the dark. Underground warfare was a horror that transcended traditional combat. In those cramped, suffocating tunnels, there was no room to swing a sword or fire a musket without collapsing the roof. When the two sides met in the crushing darkness, they fought with primitive brutality, using daggers, sharpened shovels, and even bare hands to strangle one another in the mud. The psychological toll was unbearable. At any moment, a tunnel could be discovered and the fuse lit. The ground would heave, a massive section of the city wall would vanish in a cloud of dust, and through the breach, the janissaries would swarm. The defenders were often forced to use the bodies of their fallen comrades to plug the gaps in the walls, mixing the mortar of Vienna with blood. By the first week of September, the city was a corpse. Dysentery was killing more men than the Ottoman bullets. The food stores were empty. The luxury of bread was a distant memory. Rats and cats were sold as delicacies on the black market, and soldiers boiled the leather of their own boots to make soup. The walls looked less like fortifications and more like ruins held together by sheer willpower. Count Starhemberg himself, wounded and delirious from fever, wrote one final desperate letter to the outside world. It was not a strategic report, but a plea from a dying man. There is no time left. In the name of God, save us. That plea did not go unanswered. Help came not from the emperor who had fled, but from the north. It arrived in the form of King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. Sobieski was not a king who sat on a velvet throne. He was a warrior born in the saddle, known to the Turks as the Lion of Lekistan. He had done the impossible by uniting a fractured Europe. He pulled together a massive coalition of Poles, Germans, and Austrians. Men who had spent decades hating each other, now united by a singular existential fear of the Ottoman Crescent. But gathering the army was the easy part. The real enemy was the terrain. To reach Vienna before the final wall collapsed, this relief force had to cross the Vienna woods. This was not a flat road, but a nightmare of dense, ancient forests and steep, jagged ridges. It was a natural fortress. This was Kara Mustafa's fatal mistake. The Grand Vizier was drunk on his own power, convinced of his own invincibility. He believed no Christian army would dare challenge him, and certainly not through such impassable terrain. He looked at the dense forest and deemed it impossible for heavy cavalry and cannons to traverse. He was so sure of this that he did not even bother to fortify the rear of his camp. He left his back completely exposed, handing the key to his destruction to Sobieski. For 2 agonizing days and nights, the coalition forces did the impossible. They dragged massive iron cannons up goat paths and pushed thousands of heavy war horses up vertical slopes. They moved in absolute silence, communicating with hand signals, terrified that a single noise would alert the Ottomans. The forest kept their secret. The morning of September 12th broke with a deceptive calm. Kara Mustafa stepped out of his silk tent, expecting to watch the final assault on Vienna's walls. Instead, he looked up at the Kahlenberg Heights and froze. The forest was moving. The sun caught the glint of thousands of spear tips and banners unfurled in the wind, revealing the eagles of Poland and the crosses of the Empire. The Holy League had arrived. The battle that followed did not begin with a single bang, but with a chaotic eruption of violence. Kara Mustafa committed his second fatal error, a mistake born of pure greed. Even with Sobieski breathing down his neck, he refused to stop the siege. He wanted Vienna immediately. He split his forces, sending his best infantry to die against the city walls, while sending a disorganized fraction of his army to face the fresh coalition troops on the plain. The left wing of the coalition, the Germans and Austrians, slammed into the Ottoman lines first. It was a grinder, a slaughterhouse. The Ottomans fought with the desperation of men who knew there was no retreat. For 12 hours, the fields outside Vienna became a blurred nightmare of smoke screams and clashing steel. The battle swayed back and forth. The Ottomans were being pushed back, but they were not breaking. They were too numerous. Kara Mustafa sat in his tent, still sipping his coffee, still issuing orders, arrogantly believing he could hold off the relief force while simultaneously capturing the city. He did not know that Sobieski was watching him. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows across the blood-soaked valley. The dust of battle obscured the vision, and exhaustion had set in on both sides. The Ottoman lines were stretched thin, distracted, and demoralized. High atop the hill, Jan Sobieski saw the moment. He saw the hesitation in the enemy ranks. He turned to his generals and simply nodded. From the tree line, 18,000 horsemen emerged. It was the largest cavalry charge the world had ever seen. At the tip of this spear rode 3,000 of the most terrifying warriors to ever walk the earth, the Polish winged hussars. The wings on their backs were not for fashion. They were instruments of psychological warfare. As the hussars began their descent, the wind rushing through the wooden frames created a clattering, whistling roar, a sound like 1,000 banshees screaming. Combined with the thunder of 72,000 hooves pounding the earth, it sounded like the sky itself was tearing open. The formation accelerated from a trot to a canter, and finally into a full earth-shaking gallop. To the Ottoman soldiers standing in the valley, this was not just a charge. It was a wall of iron and feathers, angels of death descending from the heavens. The impact was cataclysmic. The hussars shattered the Ottoman lines. Their long lances hollowed out for lightness, but tipped with razor-sharp steel to punch through shields, armor, and bodies. The Ottoman formation evaporated. It was no longer a battle. It was a landslide of steel. Sobieski, riding at the very front, aimed straight for the crimson tent of the Grand Vizier. Kara Mustafa, the man who had dreamed of ruling Rome, looked up and saw his death charging at him. The arrogance vanished, replaced by panic. He abandoned everything, his treasure, his maps, his dignity, and fled, leaving his vast army leaderless and broken. In less than 30 minutes, the Ottoman lines collapsed completely. The invincible army was routed. As the dust settled and the sun set on a field strewn with corpses, the soldiers of the Holy League looted the Ottoman camp. They found mountains of diamond silks and gold, but they also found something strange: piles of sacks filled with odd black beans. The Austrian soldiers, thinking it was camel feet, started to burn them. A soldier named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who had spent time in the East, smelled the roasting beans and stopped them. With those beans, he opened the first coffee house in Vienna. The rich cafe culture of Europe was born from the ashes of this slaughter, a reminder that history is woven into the very fabric of daily life. But the true weight of Vienna is far heavier than a cup of coffee. This victory was the turning point of a millennium. It marked the end of the Ottoman expansion into Europe. It was the high water mark of the Crescent. If the winged hussars had arrived 1 hour later, or if the tunnels had blown 1 day earlier, the world today would be unrecognizable. The languages spoken, the faiths held, and the borders on the map all hung in the balance of that single afternoon. Kara Mustafa escaped the battlefield, but he could not escape his failure. In the Ottoman Empire, the price of failure was absolute. A few months later in Belgrade, the Sultan's executioners came for him. He was strangled with a silk cord, his head sent to the Sultan in a velvet bag. The Battle of Vienna serves as a brutal reminder that history is not a collection of dry dates and dusty names. It is blood, fear, and the gamble of human lives on the edge of extinction. It teaches us that sometimes when the night is darkest and hope seems mathematically impossible, the ground shakes and destiny arrives on the back of a horse.